Into the teaching, we'll be looking at a step-by-step guide in project work. At the end of the meeting, you will be able to write your project yourself. Let's get started. This is the topic I'm using for example. The topic is internal audit effectiveness and financial performance of construction firm in Rivers State. Why choosing a project topic? Ensure your project topic is descriptive or correlational. Also, has dependent and independent variable and a case study. These are the things supervisor needs. Internal audit effectiveness and financial performance of construction firm in Rivers State. Internal audit effectiveness is the independent variable, while financial performance is the dependent variable. Construction firm in Rivers State is the case study. The first step in project work is the background to the study. In your background to the study, you should talk more about dependent and independent variable. The background to the study should not be less than 2 pages. The next is the statement of problem. And the statement of problem should contain the following: background information, general problem statements, scholarly support, specific problem statements, and concluding commentary. These are the things your statement of problem should contain. And your statement of problem should not be less than 1 page. So after the statement of problem, then you have conceptual framework. Some of the projects require conceptual framework, while some project does not. If your supervisor asks you for conceptual framework, that means your project needs conceptual framework. Your conceptual framework should contain your dependent and independent variable. For example, internal audit effectiveness is the independent variable. Financial performance is the dependent variable. So when you come to the independent variable, you need to get this. These are the processes. So you need to go online and search for dimension of internal audit effectiveness. Then you get your process, the dimensions of it. So for undergraduate work, sometimes most supervisors take 2 dimensions and 2 measures. 2 dimensions and 2 measures, or 3 dimensions and 3 measures. It depends on your supervisor. If I want to get my dimension, so I will take in dimension of internal audit effectiveness, so I will get my variables. Then for financial performance, which is the dependent variable, so I have to type in measures of financial performance. Then I will get in my measures. These are the way you get the variables in your conceptual framework. Conceptual framework just shows the relationship between dependent and independent variables and their process. The objective of the study. So the objective of the study has to do with the reason you embark or indulge on this project work. So you have to state it. So if I want to get my objective of the study, I have to come back to the conceptual framework if my project work demands conceptual framework. So I have to come back to intercross them. Then these are the way I formulate my objective when I use conceptual framework in my project. Then I will say to determine the extent at which competence of internal audit department influence financial performance. That is 1. Secondly, to determine the extent at which management supply for internal audits influence financial performance. Or I can also do it this way: to determine the extent at which competence of internal audit departments influence net profits of construction company in Rivers State. To determine the extent at which competence of internal audit departments influence return on investments. Then I'm done with this. I also come to this. To determine the extent at which management supply for internal audits influence net profits. And I also come to this. To determine the extent at which management supply for internal audits influence return on investment. The same way I formulate my objective, the same way I formulate my research question and hypothesis. Here is my research question. So I have to come back to the conceptual framework. If my objective is 4 in number, means my research question should also be 4 in number. If my objective is 3 in number, my research question should also be 3 in number. Question format: to what extent does competence of internal audit department influence or relate to net profits? That is 1. To what extent does competence of internal audit departments relates to return on investments. So I'm done with this. So I also come to this. To what extent does management supply for internal audits relate to net profits? To what extent does management supply for internal audits relate to return on investments? The research hypothesis. Hypothesis is a suggested answer to problem. There are two types of hypotheses. We have the null hypothesis and alternative hypothesis. Null hypothesis say there is no relationship between variables, while the alternative hypothesis say there is a relationship between variables. So in your chapter 1, where we are, your hypothesis should be in null form because the variables have not been tested with any statistical tool. So that's why you have HO1, HO2, HO3. So HO1, there's no significant relationship between competence of internal audits and net profit of construction firm in River State. 1. There's no significant relationship between competence of internal audits, departments, and return on investment of construction firm in River State. This is our conceptual framework. So this is the way we formulate our hypothesis. There's no significant relationship between competence of internal audit departments and net profits of construction firm in River State. There's no significant relationship between competence of internal audit departments and return on investments of construction firm in River State. There's no significant relationship between management supply for internal audits and net profits of construction firm in River State. There's no significant relationship between management supply for internal audits and return on investment of construction firm in River State. So these are the way you formulate your hypothesis. The significance of the study has to do with what will be the contribution of your research work to the society. We have the scope of the study. The scope of the study is subdivided into 3 categories. We have the content scope, we have the geographical scope, and we have the units of analysis. The content scope contains the research topic, which is your project topic, and the measures and dimensions. The geographical scope contains the areas you carry out your study. Unit of analysis has to do with either micro, meaning construction firm or organization you use as a case study being located in a particular area or region. We have the definition of term, which is last in chapter 1. So your definition of term should contain all the terms you use in the project. So I'm moving to chapter 2. So the chapter 2 has to do with literature review. Literature review contains the dependent and independent variable, their dimensions and measures, and even the theories of the independent variables. Our main topic is internal audit, effectiveness, and financial performance of construction firm in River State. So the first thing I do in my chapter 2, literature review, is to write on the theories of internal audit effectiveness. Here I have agency theory, contingency theory, lending credibility theory, now the conceptual review, which is the dependent and independent variables, their dimensions and measures. So the first one I have here, which is internal audit effectiveness. So I need to write on internal audit effectiveness at least 2 pages. So when I finish with the internal audit effectiveness as independent variable, then I'll have to move to their dimensions. So these ones are the internal audit effectiveness. Then work on the dimensions. So the first dimensions of internal audit effectiveness is management support for internal audit. I'll need to write on it not less than 2 pages. The second dimension of internal audit effectiveness is competence of internal audit department. So I need to write on it at least not less than 2 pages. So here I'm done with the dimensions of internal audit effectiveness. So we are now going to financial performance, which is the dependent variable, and their measures. Now we are moving to financial performance and their measures. So this is financial performance, which is the dependent variable. At least no less than 2 pages. The first measure of financial performance is net profit. So this is it, no less than 2 pages. Then the second measures of financial performance is return on investment. So the last for chapter 2 is empirical review. Your empirical review should contain scholar names and their founding. So that was make it empirical. It's different from literature review. This is chapter 3. Chapter 3 contains research methodology, which is the research design. The population of the study, which is the number of employee or staff of the company you use as a case study. Here, the target population for the study consists of 40 staff of construction companies in Rivers State. Then 3.3, which is the sample size and sampling techniques. And the sampling techniques used in this work is stratified random sampling method. Then the sample size. You use sample size when the population is too large. And the sample size I use here is Tara Yemen. And the formula for it, which is the sample size, is equal to population over 1 plus population bracket error times raised to power 2. The small letter n stands for sample size. The capital letter N stands for the population size. The E stands for the error. Then here is the calculation. The 3.4 is method of data collection. There are 2 ways to source data. We have the primary source and secondary source. The primary source of data is data sourced through questionnaires and interview. The secondary source is already published journals or articles. 3.5 is validity of instrument and reliability of instrument. Means how valid is your instrument you use for research work. Reliability of instrument means how reliable the instrument you use for your research work. Then the last in chapter 3 is method of data analysis. So what method will you use to analyze your data in chapter 4? Is this Pearson correlation or Spearman correlation or mean or standard deviation or z-test? Chapter 4. And chapter 4 contains data presentation, analysis and discussion of finding. The first in chapter 4 is the questionnaire item. Then we have the demographic analysis. Which contain the gender. Also contain the education level, marital status. They are all demographic analysis. The next stage in chapter 4 is strongly agreed, disagree, and strongly disagree. Here you formulate your questionnaire. Test of hypothesis is where you test your hypothesis by using z-test and any other statistical tool. So the final stage in chapter 4 is discussion of your finding. So at the end of the chapter 4, then we move to chapter 5. Chapter 5 in project work contains summary, conclusion, and recommendation. What your chapter 1 to 5 is made up of should be your summary of finding. Conclusion should contain your project topics and your finding. The last stage for chapter 5 is recommendation, which is your advice. So what do you advise the organization or company or state or region to do based on your finding? Then the next is reference. All the names you use in your project work should appear here, including the years. Projects start from 1 to 5 and conclude with reference. With this, you can write your project on your own without any assistance. There are 2 ways to write projects. We have projects with conceptual framework and projects without conceptual framework. For example, the first project's guide is project with conceptual framework. Then this other one is project without conceptual framework. The topic is the use of billboard advertising for enhancing sales in Port Harcourt, Rivers State, Nigeria. And this topic has two variables. Every project topic must contain two variables, which is dependent and independent variable. The use of billboard advertising is the independent variable. Enhancing sales is the dependent variable. In Port Harcourt, Rivers State, Nigeria is a case study. So while choosing a project topic, ensure your project topic has dependent and independent variable. These are the things supervisor needs. The first in your project is chapter 1, which is background to the study. The background to the study should details on independent variable. The independent variable for this work is billboard advertising, including scholar names and years. And also conclude your background with dependent variable. And your background to the study should not less than 2 pages. The next is statement of problem. Your statement of problem should contain the following: background information, general problem statements, scholarly supports, specific problem statements, and concluding commentary. These are the things that will contain in your statement of problem. Then we have the purpose of the study. The purpose of the study deals with the reason you conduct the research work. Here, one of it is that to ascertain the extent to which Nigerians are exposed to billboard advertising. 2, to identify what actually attracts the public to adhere to billboard advertising in Port Harcourt. 3, to determine the extent at which billboard advertising influence buying habits of Genesis eateries in Port Harcourt. That is the purpose of the study. Then we have research question. Your research question should be in line with the purpose of the study. What you need here is to change your purpose of study into research question. The first research question: to what extent does Nigerians are exposed to billboard advertising? The first purpose of study is now in question form. Then point 2, to what extent does public adhere to billboard advertising in Port Harcourt? The second purpose of study is now in question form. Point 3, to what extent does billboard advertising influence buying habits of Genesis eatery in Port Harcourt? Then the third purpose of study is now in question form. Here we have the research hypothesis. Hypothesis is suggested answer to problem. And there are 2 types of hypotheses. You have the null hypothesis and alternative hypothesis. The null hypothesis states there is no relationship between variables, while the alternative hypothesis says there is a relationship between variables. So in your chapter 1, the hypothesis should be in null form because they have not been tested with any statistical tools. HO1, Nigeria are not exposed to billboard advertising. Public does not adhere to billboard advertising in Port Harcourt. They are all null hypotheses. So your chapter 1 hypothesis should be in null form. The significance of the study. The significance of the study has to do with the contribution of your work to the society at large. Then the scope of the study. The scope of the study has to do with the area covered in your research work. Definition of time, which is the end of chapter 1, means all the terms used in your project work should be well defined based on the way they are used in your work. Then the chapter 2 has to do with literature review. And the first point in chapter 2 should go with the theory, the theoretical framework or theoretical review. And your theory should be based on your independent variable, which is billboard advertising. You can have more than 2 theories in your research work. The first theory here is cultivation theory. Then we also have cognitive theory. Then after the theory, the next stage for chapter 2 is conceptual review. Start to discuss on dependent variable and independent variable and their process. Even when your project work does not have conceptual framework, ensure that you have their process, dimensions and measures. Those are the things you develop in chapter 2 under conceptual review. Look for their measures and dimensions of the dependent and independent variable. Importance of advertising media. They are all under review. Television. They are all under review. Billboard advertising. They are all under review. Brief history of billboard advertising. The role of billboard advertising in business. They are all under review. Factors associated with the success of billboard advertisements. Perception of billboard advertisements. Billboard advertising and consumer purchase decision. Online advertising. Mobile billboard advertising. These are the things you have in your conceptual review. Conceptual review make your project work to be volume, and your project work should not be less than 50 pages. After a conceptual review, you have the empirical review, which is the last in chapter 2. The empirical review should contain the scholars, their research and their founding. For example, Taylor and Bank, 1999. This is their research work and their foundings. They also have Taylor and Frank, 2003. Their research work and their founding. Lee and Kakut, their research work and founding. And many other ones. Then we move to chapter 3. Chapter 3 contains research methodology, which is the first is research design. So the research design you use in your project work. So here the research design I use in this research work is survey research design. The next in chapter 3 is population of the study. So what is your population of your study? You need to state it. So the population for this study is this. Then we have the sample size and sampling techniques. The sampling techniques used for this research work is stratified random sampling method. And the sample size. The sample size is used when the population is too large. You use sample size to reduce the population figure. The sample size method I use is Tara Your Man, where small letter n stands for sample size. Capital letter N stands for population. And A, which is the level of significance, which is the arrow term. Then we have the method of data collection. There are two ways to source data, either primary source and secondary source. A primary source is data sourced through questionnaire and interview, while the secondary source are the already published journals, textbooks and articles. Then we have the validity and reliability of instruments. The validity of instruments means how valid the instrument you use in your research work. Reliability stands for how reliable the instrument you use in your research work. The method of data analysis. So here you state the method you use to analyze your data in chapter 4. Whether Pearson correlation coefficient or Spearman rank correlation or mean standard deviation and z-test. Any method you state here is the statistical method you use in your chapter 4 to test your hypothesis. So that is the end of chapter 3. Chapter 4 contains data presentation, analysis and discussion of finding. These are our data presentation in percentage. Demographic analysis, which contain gender, age, education, and marital status. Gender, age, education level, and marital status. Billboard advertising campaign increase sales volume of Genesis Eatery in Port Harcourt. Strongly agree, agree, disagree, and strongly disagree. This is analysis or test of hypothesis. Here I use Spearman rank correlation to test my hypothesis. And this is the formula for Spearman rank correlation. So this is the second hypothesis test. I'm still on Spearman rank. The last in your chapter 4 is discussion on founding. Here is chapter 5. Chapter 5 contains summary, conclusion, and recommendation. Your chapter 5 summaries should contain what your chapter 1 is made up of, 2 is made up of, 3, 4, and 5, what they are made up of. Conclusion. Your conclusion should contain your project topic and your founding. The recommendation. Recommendation, you draft your recommendation based on your founding. The last is the reference. means all the names used in your project work, you should reference them. If you want me to assist you in project work, you can reach me with the email or number below. Thank you for watching and see you in my next video.